The indigenous peoples of the Pacific Northwest coast were of many nations and tribal affiliations, each with distinctive cultural and political identities. Still, they shared certain beliefs, traditions, and practices, such as the centrality of salmon as a resource and spiritual symbol. Their gift-giving feast, potlatch, is a highly complex event where people gather to commemorate special events. These events include the raising of a totem pole or the appointment or election of a new chief. The most famous artistic feature of the culture is the totem pole, with carvings of animals and other characters to commemorate cultural beliefs, legends, and notable events. The Mississippian culture was a mound-building Native American civilization. Archaeologists date from approximately 800 CE to 1600 CE, varying regionally. It was composed of a series of urban settlements and satellite villages, suburbs, linked together by a loose trading network, the most significant city being Cahokia, believed to be an important religious center. The civilization flourished in what is now the Midwestern, Eastern, and Southeastern United States. Numerous pre-Columbian societies were urbanized, such as the Pueblo peoples, Mandan, and Hidatsa. The Iroquois League of Nations, or People of the Longhouse, was a politically advanced, democratic society which is thought by some historians to have influenced the United States Constitution, with the Senate passing a resolution to this effect in 1988. Other historians have contested this interpretation and believe the impact was minimal or did not exist, pointing to numerous differences between the two systems and the ample precedents for the Constitution in European political thought. The Pequot War was an armed conflict that took place between 1636 and 1638 in New England between the Pequot tribe and an alliance of the colonists of the Massachusetts Bay, Plymouth, and Saybrook colonies, and their allies from the Narragansett and Mohegan tribes. The war concluded with the decisive defeat of the Pequots. The colonies of Connecticut and Massachusetts offered bounties for the heads of killed hostile Indians and later for just their scalps during the Pequot War in the 1630s. Connecticut specifically reimbursed Mohegans for slaying the Pequot in 1637. In the end, about 700 Pequots had been killed or taken into captivity. The English colonists imposed a harshly punitive treaty on the estimated 2,500 Pequots who survived the war. The Treaty of Hartford of 1638 sought to eradicate the Pequot cultural identity, with terms prohibiting the Pequots from returning to their lands, speaking their tribal language, or even referring to themselves as Pequots, and effectively dissolved the Pequot Nation, with many survivors executed or enslaved and sold away. Hundreds of prisoners were sold into slavery in the West Indies. Other survivors were dispersed as captives to the victorious tribes. The result was eliminating the Pequot tribe as a viable polity in southern New England, the colonial authorities classifying them as extinct. However, members of the Pequot tribe still live today as a federally recognized tribe. The Great Swamp Massacre was committed during King Philip's War by the colonial militia of New England on the Narragansett tribe in December 1675. On December 15th of that year, Narragansett warriors attacked the Girey Bull Blockhouse and killed at least 15 people. 4 days later, the militias from the English colonies of Plymouth, Connecticut, and Massachusetts Bay were led to the main Narragansett town in South Kingstown, Rhode Island. The settlement was burned, its inhabitants, including women and children, killed or evicted, and most of the tribe's winter stores destroyed. It is believed that at least 97 Narragansett warriors and 300 to 1,000 non-combatants were killed, though exact figures are unknown. The massacre was a critical blow to the Narragansett tribe during the period directly following the killings. However, much like the Pequot, the Narragansett people continue to live today as a federally recognized tribe. On June 12, 1755, during the French and Indian War, Massachusetts Governor William Shirley issued a bounty of $40 for a male Indian scalp and $20 for scalps of Indian females or of children under 12 years old. In 1756, Pennsylvania Lieutenant Governor Robert Hunter Morris, in his declaration of war against the Lenni Lenape Delaware people, offered 130 pieces of 8 for the scalp of every male Indian enemy above the age of 12 years and 50 pieces of 8 for the scalp of every Indian woman, produced as evidence of their being killed. During Pontiac's War, Colonel Henry Bouquet conspired with his superior, Sir Geoffrey Amherst, to infect hostile Native Americans through biological warfare with smallpox blankets. The Indian removal was the United States government policy of ethnic cleansing through forced displacement of self-governing tribes of American Indians from their ancestral homelands in the eastern United States to lands west of the Mississippi River, specifically to a designated Indian territory, roughly present-day Oklahoma, which many scholars have labeled a genocide. The Indian Removal Act of 1830, the critical act authorized the removal of native tribes, was signed into law by United States President Andrew Jackson on May 28, 1830. Although Jackson took a hard line on Indian removal, the law was enforced primarily during the Martin Van Buren administration. After the enactment of the act, approximately 60,000 members of the Cherokee, Muscogee, Creek, Seminole, Chickasaw, and Choctaw nations, including thousands of their black slaves, were forcibly removed from their ancestral homelands, with thousands dying during the Trail of Tears. The Trail of Tears was an ethnic cleansing by the United States government that displaced approximately 60,000 people of the 5 civilized tribes between 1830 and 1850. As part of the Indian removal, members of the Cherokee, Muscogee, Creek, Seminole, Chickasaw, and Choctaw nations were forcibly removed from their ancestral homelands in the southeastern United States to newly designated Indian Territory west of the Mississippi River after the passage of the Indian Removal Act in 1830. The Cherokee removal in 1838, the last forced removal east of the Mississippi, was brought on by the discovery of gold near Dahlonega, Georgia, in 1828, resulting in the Georgia Gold Rush. The relocated peoples suffered from exposure, disease, and starvation, while en route to their newly designated Indian Reserve. Thousands died from disease before reaching their destinations or shortly after. Some historians have said that the event constituted a genocide, although this label remains a matter of debate. According to Chalk and Jonason, the deportation of the Cherokee tribe along the Trail of Tears would almost certainly be considered an act of genocide today. The Indian Removal Act of 1830 led to the departure of about 17,000 Cherokees, along with approximately 2,000 Cherokee-owned enslaved black people were removed from their homes. Historians such as David Stannard and Barbara Mann have noted that the Army deliberately routed the march of the Cherokee to pass through areas of a known cholera epidemic, such as Vicksburg. Stannard estimates that during the forced removal from their homelands following the Indian Removal Act, signed into law by President Andrew Jackson in 1830, 8,000 Cherokee died, about half the total population. There was also the Long Walk, another ethnic cleansing by the United States government. It was a forced journey on foot by the Navajo people to Bosque Redondo. Navajos were forced to walk from their land in western New Mexico Territory, modern-day Arizona, to Bosque Redondo in eastern New Mexico. The Yavapai exodus was the relocation of the Yavapai group. After the war, the Yavapai and Tonto were removed from the Camp Verde Reservation to San Carlos on February 27, 1875. About 1,400 people were relocated in these travel. The Yavapai was beaten with whips through rivers of melted snow, in which many drowned. Any Yavapai who lagged was left behind or shot. The march led to 375 deaths. Indian removal policies led to the current reservation system, which allocated territories to individual tribes. Once their territories were incorporated into the United States, surviving Native Americans were denied equality before the law and often treated as wards of the state. Many Native Americans were moved to reservations, constituting 4% of U.S. territory. In several cases, treaties signed with Native Americans were violated. Tens of thousands of American Indians and Alaska Natives were forced to attend a residential school system that sought to re-educate them in white settler American values, culture, and economy. From the colonial period through the founding of the United States and continuing in the 20th century, it has entailed torture, terror, sexual abuse, massacres, systematic military occupations, removals of indigenous peoples from their ancestral territories via Indian removal policies, forced removal of Native American children to boarding schools, allotment, and a policy of termination. With the 1848 Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which gave the United States authority over 525,000 square miles of new territory, plus the Gold Rush slaughter, there became a large number of state-subsidized massacres by colonists against Native Americans within the territory, causing several entire ethnic groups to be wiped out. In one such series of conflicts, the so-called Mendocino War and the subsequent Round Valley War, the entirety of the Yuki people were brought to the brink of extinction. From a previous population of some 3,500 people, fewer than 100 members of the Yuki tribe were left. According to Russell Thornton, estimates of the pre-Columbian population of California may have been as high as 300,000. By 1849, due to several epidemics, the number had decreased to 150,000. But from 1849 up until 1890, the indigenous population of California had fallen below 20,000, primarily because of the killings. At least 4,500 California Indians were killed between 1849 and 1870, while many more perished due to disease and starvation. 1,000 more Indians were also kidnapped and sold as slaves. During the Indian Wars, the American Army carried out several massacres and forced relocations of indigenous peoples that are sometimes considered genocide. Jeffrey Ostler, the Beekman Professor of Northwest and Pacific History at the University of Oregon, stated the American Indian War was a genocidal war. Xavier Irujo, Professor of Genocide Studies at the University of Nevada, Reno, said, "The toll on human lives in the wars against the native nations between 1848 and 1881 was horrific." Notable conflicts in this period include the Dakota War, the Great Sioux War, the Comanche Campaign, the Snake War, and the Colorado War. These conflicts occurred in the United States from the earliest colonial settlements in the 17th century until the end of the 19th century. The wars resulted from several factors, the most common being the desire of settlers and governments for Indian tribes' lands. The 1864 Sand Creek Massacre, which caused outrage in its own time, has been regarded as a genocide. Colonel John Chivington led a 700-man force of Colorado Territory militia in a massacre of 163 peaceful Cheyenne and Arapaho, about two-thirds of whom were women, children, and infants. Chivington and his men took scalps and other body parts as trophies, including human fetuses and male and female genitalia. The Native American boarding school system was a 150-year program and federal policy that separated indigenous children from their families and sought to assimilate them into white society. It began in the early 19th century, coinciding with the start of Indian removal policies. A federal Indian boarding school initiative investigative report was published on May 11, 2022, officially acknowledging the federal government's role in creating and perpetuating this system. According to the report, the U.S. federal government operated or funded more than 408 boarding institutions in 37 states between 1819 and 1969. 431 boarding schools were identified, many of which were run by religious institutions. The report described the system as part of a federal policy aimed at eradicating the identity of indigenous communities and confiscating their lands. Abusi was widespread at the schools, as was overcrowding, malnutrition, DZC, and lack of adequate health care. The report documented over 500 child deaths at 19 schools, although it is estimated the total number could rise to thousands, and possibly even tens of thousands. Marked or unmarked burial sites were discovered at 53 schools. The school system has been described as cultural genocide and racist dehumanizing. The United States has today not undertaken any truth commission nor built a memorial for the genocide of indigenous people. It does not acknowledge nor compensate for the historical violence against Native Americans that occurred during territorial expansion to the West Coast. American museums such as the Smithsonian Institution do not dedicate a section to the genocide. In 2013, the National Congress of American Indians passed a resolution to create a space for the National American Indian Holocaust Museum inside the Smithsonian, but the latter ignored it. According to American historian Ned Blackhawk, nationalist historiographies have been forms of denial that erase the history of the destruction of European colonial expansion. Blackhawk said that near consensus has emerged that genocide against some indigenous peoples took place in North America following colonization. Benjamin Madley also argued that indigenous resistance to genocidal campaigns has resulted in these campaigns being inaccurately described as war or battles instead of genocidal massacres. David Moshman, a professor at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, emphasized the lack of awareness of the American public, stating that the nations of the Americas are virtually oblivious to their emergence from a series of genocides that were deliberately aimed at and succeeded in eliminating hundreds of indigenous cultures. That's all for now on the Native American genocide. You can subscribe for more related content and don't forget to like this video.